"You've always been nothing but a burden, Margaret," Olivia said, her voice light enough to pass as a joke, but sharp enough to cut straight through me. And for a moment the entire dining room went quiet in that way it does when something has just gone too far, but no one wants to be the one to say it. The soft clink of silverware stopping midair, the low hum of conversation fading into nothing. And I could feel every eye at the table flick toward me before quickly looking away again, as if my reaction might make them uncomfortable, as if my humiliation was something contagious they didn't want to catch. And I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same hands that had set this table just an hour earlier, the same hands that had cooked this meal, paid for half the groceries, kept this family together for decades. And I simply smiled, not wide, not forced. Just enough to let her believe she had landed the blow she intended, just enough to let everyone else return to their plates as if nothing had happened, and Olivia leaned back in her chair, satisfied, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve like she had just tidied up a small inconvenience, while my son Daniel sat beside her, quiet, his eyes fixed on his plate, not defending me, not even acknowledging what had just been said, and that silence from him, that quiet agreement, was louder than anything she could have said. But I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for an apology, because in that moment, I understood something very clearly, something that took me nearly 70 years to fully accept. Respect is not given out of history or sacrifice or even love. It is given only when people believe you have the power to take it back. And at that table, in that house I had once called mine, they believed I had none. So I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with steady hands, the condensation leaving a small ring on the polished wood, a mark that would fade in minutes, just like they expected this moment to fade, just like they expected me to fade. And Olivia laughed softly at something someone else said, already moving on, already forgetting, because to her this was nothing more than another small reminder of where she believed I stood in this family. Beneath her, beneath the life she had built with my son, a life she had gradually shaped to leave no space for me. And I watched her carefully then, not with anger, not even with hurt, but with a kind of quiet clarity that settles in when everything finally makes sense. Every missed invitation, every changed plan, every time I was told it would be easier if I just stayed home, every small decision made without me that slowly became a life lived without me. It all fit now, like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying not to see. And across the table Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, as if he could feel my gaze without looking up, but he still said nothing, and that told me everything I needed to know. So when the plates began to clear and the conversation picked back up, I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my sweater, and no one stopped me, no one asked where I was going. Because to them, I was already gone, just a quiet presence that had outlived its usefulness. And I walked out of that dining room without a word, the sound of laughter following me down the hallway, fading with each step until all I could hear was the soft echo of my own footsteps against the hardwood floors, the same floors I had chosen years ago, back when this house was still mine and more than just memory. And as I reached the front door, I paused for just a second, my hand resting lightly on the handle, not hesitating, not doubting, just taking in the stillness, because something inside me had shifted, something quiet but permanent. And I realized then that I didn't need to correct her. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't even need to stay, because sometimes the most powerful response is the one no one sees coming. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, closing the door gently behind me, I let her believe she had won. I let all of them believe it, because in the end, that would be the first mistake they would never recover from. I did not go far that night, just to the small guest house across town that I had kept over the years more out of habit than necessity. A quiet place with a narrow driveway and a porch light that flickered once before settling into a steady glow. And as I stepped inside, the air felt different from the house I had just left, not warmer, not colder, just honest, as if it expected nothing from me and demanded nothing in return. And I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the sound echoing slightly in the stillness, then stood there for a moment with my coat still on, listening to the silence wrap around me, because silence can mean many things, and this kind, I realized, was not the kind that excludes you, but the kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time in a very long while. And I slowly removed my coat, folding it neatly over the back of a chair, the same careful way I had done everything for decades, out of respect for a home, for a family, for a life that I now understood had been shifting quietly beneath my feet without my permission. And I walked into the living room where the furniture still sat exactly as I had arranged it years ago, untouched, unchanged, a place frozen in time while everything else had moved on without me. And I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, the fabric firm beneath me, grounding, real, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, not a dramatic sigh, not a release of sorrow, just a steady exhale that marked the end of something I had been carrying for far too long. And I began to think back, not to tonight, but to the small moments that had led here, the quiet adjustments, the subtle shifts, the times Daniel had canceled our lunches because something came up, the holidays that became shorter visits, the decisions that were made and then presented to me as if they were already settled. And Olivia, always polite enough on the surface, always smiling, always careful with her words in public, but there was something underneath that I had chosen not to name. Something that operated in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses, in the things left unsaid, and I had told myself it was just change, just life moving forward, just a new generation building their own rhythm. But sitting there in that quiet room, I could see it clearly now. It was not change, it was replacement, slow and deliberate. And I had allowed it because I believed that love would naturally make space for me, that being a mother, being the one who had built everything from the ground up, would always mean something, but respect, I realized, does not follow history, it follows perception. And somewhere along the way, they had begun to see me as someone who could be moved, managed, spoken over, and eventually dismissed. And I reached for the small notebook I kept in the drawer beside the chair, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and I opened it to a blank page, the paper crisp under my fingers, and I wrote down a single line in steady, careful handwriting. Not because I needed to remember it, but because I needed to see it in front of me, to make it real. I am not a burden, and I looked at those words for a long moment, letting them settle, letting them take root in a way they had not before, because saying something in your mind is one thing, but acknowledging it with intention is another. And I closed the notebook gently, placing it back in the drawer, my movements calm, deliberate, as if I had all the time in the world, because for the first time in years, I felt no urgency to prove anything to anyone. No need to return to a place where I was no longer valued. And as I sat there, the quiet of the room no longer felt empty. It felt like space, space to think, space to see clearly, space to decide what came next. And I understood then that whatever I chose to do, it would not be rushed, it would not be emotional, and it would not be visible until it needed to be. Because some things are not meant to be announced. They are meant to unfold, slowly, carefully, until the moment they can no longer be ignored. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, without interruption, just a pale line of sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and stretching slowly across the wooden floor, and I woke before the clock on the nightstand reached 6, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun sorting through everything with a kind of calm precision that surprised even me. And I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room and the distant sound of a car passing by, ordinary sounds that felt strangely grounding after the tension of the night before, and I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, noticing how steady I felt, how clear everything seemed, as if something inside me had finally aligned after years of quiet imbalance. And I moved through the small house with deliberate care, making coffee the way I always had, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, waiting for it to brew, small rituals that once filled empty space, but now felt intentional, controlled, mine. And as I stood at the counter holding the warm mug in both hands, I began to revisit details I had overlooked before, not with emotion, but with observation, like someone studying a pattern from a distance. And I remembered the afternoon Olivia insisted on helping me organize my paperwork, how she had gently suggested moving certain documents into a shared folder for convenience, how she had asked casual questions about account numbers and property records, all wrapped in concern and efficiency. And at the time I had appreciated the help, grateful even. But now those moments took on a different shape, sharper, more deliberate. And I thought about the times Daniel had reassured Me that everything was being taken care of, that I did not need to worry about the details anymore, that I should just rest, enjoy life, let them handle things, and I had believed him, because that is what mothers do when they trust their children. They step back, they make space, they assume good intentions, but trust without awareness can become permission, and permission, when given to the wrong hands, can slowly turn into control. And I set the mug down gently, the ceramic touching the counter with a soft, final sound, and I walked over to the small desk by the window where I kept a few important papers, not many, just enough to manage what I needed, and I opened the drawer, pulling out a thin folder, flipping through the pages one by one, not searching for anything specific at first, just reacquainting myself with what was mine, what had always been mine. And then I noticed something small, something that might have seemed insignificant before, a change in formatting on one of the documents, a forwarding address that was not mine, subtle, easy to overlook, but once seen, impossible to ignore, and I paused, my fingers resting lightly on the page, not reacting, not rushing to conclusions, just acknowledging the detail and letting it settle into place among everything else I had begun to understand. And I closed the folder slowly, placing it back into the drawer with the same care I had used to open it, because clarity does not demand immediate action, it demands patience. And I turned toward the window, looking out at the quiet street where the morning had fully arrived, neighbors beginning their routines, doors opening, cars starting, life moving forward as it always does. And I realized that whatever had been happening around me had not been sudden. It had been gradual, layered, built on small decisions and quiet assumptions. And if it had taken time to unfold, then it would take equal care to unravel. And I reached for my phone, not to call Daniel, not to confront Olivia, but to scroll through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed in years. A number I had once relied on but had set aside when I believed everything was settled, and I looked at it for a moment before setting the phone back down without dialing. Not yet, because timing matters, and there are moments when speaking too soon gives away more than silence ever could. And as I stood there, watching the morning continue outside that window, I understood something with quiet certainty. They believed they had already taken control. They believed the decisions had already been made. But what they did not understand was that nothing had been finalized, not truly, and until it was, the story was still mine to write. By mid-morning, the house no longer felt like a place I had retreated to, but a place I had returned to, and that distinction mattered more than I expected, because retreat suggests weakness, while return suggests intention, and I moved through the rooms with a quiet awareness that each step I took now carried a different kind of weight, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate. And I opened the closet in the hallway, reaching for a box I had not touched in years, one that held older records, documents from before Daniel was married, from before Olivia had ever stepped into our lives. And I placed it carefully on the dining table, lifting the lid slowly as if I were opening something fragile, not because the papers inside could break, but because of what they represented, decisions made in trust, agreements built on promises that were never meant to be questioned. And I began sorting through them one by one, property deeds, insurance statements, copies of agreements that had once felt like formalities but now read like quiet lines of authority. And as I read, I noticed the language, the names, the signatures, and more importantly, the absence of certain names where they did not belong, a silence in ink that spoke louder than any conversation I had endured. And I paused over one document in particular, tracing the date with my finger, remembering the day it had been signed, the confidence I had felt, the certainty that everything was structured to protect what I had built. And I realized then that while they had been making plans, they had been doing so under assumptions that relied on my inaction, on my willingness to remain uninvolved. And that was their advantage, but also their blind spot, because they believed that what had not been questioned would never be challenged. And I closed the folder gently, stacking the papers neatly back into place, my movement steady, unhurried, because nothing I was doing required urgency, only accuracy. And I carried the box back to the closet, returning it exactly where it had been, as if nothing had changed, because on the surface, nothing had, not yet. And I stepped outside onto the small porch, the air warmer now, the sun higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. And I stood there for a moment, letting the light settle over me, not seeking comfort from it, but acknowledging its presence, the simple, undeniable clarity of daylight. And I thought about Daniel, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet distance, remembering the boy who once asked for my advice on everything, who once believed I had all the answers, and I wondered at what point that shifted, at what moment my voice became optional in his life, but I did not dwell on it. Because understanding does not require revisiting every memory. It only requires recognizing the pattern, and the pattern was clear now, consistent, intentional, and most importantly, predictable. And predictability is something that can be used, not against someone, but in preparation for what they will do next. And I turned back inside, reaching for my phone once more, this time not hesitating as I scrolled to that familiar name, the one I had seen earlier but chosen not to call, and I pressed it, holding the phone to my ear as it rang once, twice, before a steady voice answered on the other end, calm, professional, unchanged by time, and I spoke clearly, without explanation, without emotion, simply stating that I needed to review everything, all accounts, all properties, all legal arrangements, because I believed it was time to ensure that what was mine remained exactly that. And there was a brief pause on the line, not of confusion, but of understanding, as if the person on the other end recognized the weight of what I was asking without needing further detail, and we arranged to meet later. That week, nothing rushed, nothing dramatic, just a quiet step forward that would not be visible to anyone else until it needed to be. And when I ended the call, I placed the phone back down with the same steady hand I had used all morning, because this was not a reaction, it was a decision, and decisions, when made with clarity, do not need to be announced. They only need to be carried out, one careful step at a time. The meeting was set for Thursday at 10 in the morning, and I arrived exactly 5 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I have always believed that timing reflects intention, and I wanted mine to be clear from the very beginning, and the office had not changed much. Over the years, the same neutral walls, the same quiet hum of a printer somewhere in the background, the same orderly rows of chairs that suggested everything here operated on structure and precision, and I took a seat by the window, placing my purse neatly beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap as I waited, observing the small details around me, the way the receptionist moved with quiet efficiency, the way the clock on the wall ticked forward without hesitation, because in places like this, everything moves forward whether you are ready or not. And when my name was called, I stood and followed the familiar hallway, each step steady, each breath even, until I entered the office where Mr. Harris was already waiting, rising slightly from his chair in greeting, his expression professional but attentive, as if he understood that this was not a casual visit, and I sat across from him, meeting his eyes without urgency, without hesitation, simply present, and he asked how he could help me, his tone measured, leaving space for me to speak. And I did not begin with explanations or emotions. I simply stated that I wanted a complete review of everything, every account, every document, every designation, because I needed to confirm that nothing had been altered without my direct knowledge. And he listened without interruption, nodding slightly as he opened a file on his desk, his movements methodical, precise, and he began pulling up records, documents I had signed, documents I had trusted, documents that now required a second look, not because I doubted their existence, but because I needed to understand how they could be used. And as he walked me through each section, I followed carefully, asking questions when necessary, not many, just enough to clarify, to confirm, to ensure that every detail aligned with what I believed to be true. And there were moments where his tone shifted slightly, subtle pauses where he pointed out clauses that could allow for shared access under certain conditions, permissions that could be extended if requested, processes that could be initiated if I remained uninvolved, and I listened to each one without reacting, because information does not require emotion, it requires attention. And when he finished, I folded my hands neatly on the desk and asked what changes could be made to ensure that no action could be taken without my explicit approval, and he outlined the steps clearly, removing secondary access, updating authorizations, reinforcing ownership, all of it straightforward, all of it entirely within my control, and I nodded once, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Nothing had been taken yet, not legally, not completely, but the pathway had been prepared, quietly, patiently. waiting for the moment when I would step back far enough for someone else to step in, and I thanked him, not out of politeness, but because clarity deserves acknowledgement, and we began the process, not rushed, not dramatic, just a series of signatures, confirmations, adjustments, each one small on its own, but together forming something solid, something undeniable. And when it was done, I stood, smoothing the sleeve of my coat, feeling no sense of victory, no surge of emotion, just a quiet steadiness that comes from knowing where you stand. And as I walked out of that office, past the receptionist, past the ticking clock, out into the open air, I understood that nothing outward had changed yet. Daniel would still believe everything was under control. Olivia would still move through her plans with confidence. But what they did not see, what they could not see, was that the ground beneath those plans had already begun to shift, and by the time they noticed, it would no longer be something they could adjust to. It would be something they would have to face. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt unchanged on the surface. The same quiet rooms, the same soft light filtering through the curtains, the same stillness that most people would have mistaken for peace. But I now understood that stillness does not always mean calm. Sometimes it simply means something is waiting, and I moved through the space slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, noticing things I had not paid attention to before, the way certain drawers had been left slightly more organized than I remembered, the way small items had shifted positions over time without explanation, subtle changes that once would have seemed insignificant, but now formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. And I sat at the kitchen table, placing my hands flat on the wood, feeling its familiar surface beneath my fingertips, and I thought about Daniel, about Olivia, about the way conversations had become shorter over the past months, how decisions had been made and presented to me as completed rather than discussed, and I realized that control does not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as convenience, as someone offering to help until you no longer notice you are no longer involved. And I opened my phone, scrolling through messages, not looking for anything in particular at first, just observing, until I found a thread of small updates about household matters that I had not been directly included in, decisions about maintenance, appointments, arrangements that had once always passed through me, and I read them carefully, not with anger, but with a growing sense of structure, as if I were finally seeing the outline of something that had been forming quietly in the background for a long time. And I set the phone down, leaning back in my chair, letting the information settle, because reacting too quickly would serve no purpose. And I have learned over time that clarity is most useful when it is allowed to fully form before action follows. And later that evening Daniel called, his voice familiar but slightly rushed, asking if everything was fine, and I answered calmly, saying that everything was in order, because it was not a lie. It simply meant something different to me now. And he spoke briefly about upcoming plans, about adjustments that would be made in the following weeks, his tone carrying the same assumption that I would simply accept and adapt. But I listened without interruption, noting each detail, each implication, each expectation. And when he finished, there was a short pause, as if he expected more from me, perhaps agreement, perhaps reassurance, but I only said I understood, and I did not offer anything further. And after the call ended, I remained seated for a while in the quiet kitchen, the phone still in my hand, feeling no need to fill the silence, because silence no longer felt like absence, it felt like space. And in that space, I began to see more clearly the shape of everything that had been built without my awareness, not as a sudden betrayal, but as a gradual replacement of roles. And I understood now that what mattered was not what had already been done, but what had been assumed would continue without question. And I stood up, walking to the window, looking out at the steady evening light, and I made no decision in that moment, no declaration, no emotional conclusion, only recognition, because recognition is the point where everything changes direction, even if nothing outside has moved yet, and I knew that from this point forward, nothing would continue on the same assumption it had before. The following morning arrived with a different weight to it, not heavier, not lighter, but more defined, as if the world had quietly agreed to reveal its structure a little more clearly than before, and I found myself waking earlier than usual again, not out of restlessness, but out of habit that no longer served the same purpose, and I sat at the edge of the bed for a moment before standing noticing how even my smallest movements had begun to slow down into something more deliberate, and I prepared coffee in silence, watching the dark liquid fill the cup with steady predictability. And as I stood by the kitchen counter, I received a message from Daniel asking if I would be available for dinner that evening. A simple question framed as routine, but one that now carried more weight than it used to, because nothing felt entirely routine anymore. And I replied with a short confirmation, neither eager nor resistant, simply present. And I spent the rest of the day moving through my home with quiet attention, not searching for problems, but observing patterns, the way certain spaces no longer felt shared, the way certain decisions no longer required my input. And I noticed how easily absence becomes normal when it is introduced gradually, until no one remembers when it began. And by late afternoon I dressed calmly, choosing something simple, not for appearance, but for comfort. And I arrived at Daniel's house just as the light outside began to soften, the kind of light that makes everything look familiar even when it is not. And Olivia greeted me at the door with her usual composed smile, warm on the surface, precise underneath. And she stepped aside to let me in as if I were entering a space I was expected to observe rather than participate in. And Daniel was already inside, standing near the living room, speaking briefly about something on his phone before placing it down when he saw me. And the three of us sat together as dinner was prepared, conversation moving in familiar circles, safe topics, practical updates, careful phrasing that avoided anything too direct, and I listened more than I spoke, watching how easily the rhythm of their household functioned without needing to include me in its center. And at one point Olivia mentioned upcoming changes to their schedule, speaking as if they had already been agreed upon, and Daniel nodded along, adding details, small confirmations that built a picture of decisions already made. And I did not interrupt. I did not question. I simply observed, because understanding does not always require participation. And there was a moment during the meal when Daniel looked at me, briefly, as if expecting a response, perhaps approval, perhaps adjustment, but I only met his gaze calmly and continued eating, and the conversation moved on without pause, as if that silence had been interpreted as agreement. And later, when plates were cleared and the evening began to wind down, Olivia excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Daniel and me alone for a short while. And he spoke again about future arrangements, about efficiency, about making things easier for everyone. And I listened to each word carefully, noticing not just what was being said, but what was being assumed beneath it. And when he finished, I nodded once, acknowledging the information without resistance. And there was a brief silence between us, the kind that often gets mistaken for understanding, but I knew better now, because silence can hold many meanings, depending on who controls the direction of the conversation. And I stood shortly after, thanking him for dinner, my voice steady, my tone unchanged, and I did not stay longer than necessary, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I had already received everything I needed from the evening, not in words, but in structure, in behavior, in expectation. And as I stepped back out into the cool night air, I realized that nothing had been said openly that could be called confrontation yet. Everything important had been revealed, and I walked to my car without looking back, understanding that the next step would not come from reaction, but from preparation. The morning of the meeting arrived with a stillness that felt different from the previous ones, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had, and I moved through my home with the same quiet precision as before. Yet now every action carried a clearer sense of direction, as if I were no longer reacting to life, but observing it unfold exactly as expected. And I prepared myself without hurry, choosing simple clothing, nothing that would draw attention or suggest emotion beyond what was necessary. And I left the house earlier than needed, driving through familiar streets that now seemed less like paths and more like connections between decisions already made. And when I arrived, I parked at the edge of the lot and sat for a moment in the car, watching people pass by, each absorbed in their own routines, unaware of anything shifting beneath the surface of their ordinary morning. And I understood then how easily control can exist without being seen, because most people only notice what is spoken aloud, not what is arranged quietly in advance. And when I finally stepped out of the car, I felt no hesitation, only alignment, as if every step I had taken over the past weeks had led precisely to this point. And inside the building, I was guided to a familiar room where Daniel was already present, standing near the table. His expression composed but slightly uncertain in a way he was trying to hide, and Olivia sat beside him, her posture perfect, her attention focused forward, but her fingers moved subtly against the edge of the table in a rhythm that suggested tension she did not acknowledge. And there were documents laid out neatly in front of them, papers arranged with the kind of order that suggests confidence, and I took my seat across from them without delay, placing my bag beside my chair, my hands resting naturally in front of me. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, as if each of us was waiting for the conversation to begin in the correct direction. And then Daniel cleared his throat softly, beginning to explain adjustments they had prepared, speaking about transitions, responsibilities, and future structure, using words that sounded practical but carried assumptions within them, assumptions that everything would proceed as planned, and Olivia added details smoothly, reinforcing the direction of the conversation with calm certainty, occasionally glancing at me as if measuring my response before I gave it. And I listened without interruption, allowing each sentence to complete fully before considering its meaning, because interruption would have changed nothing at that stage. And I had learned that understanding comes more clearly when one allows others to reveal their intentions completely. And when they finished speaking, they looked at me, not all at once, but in sequence, as if expecting alignment, agreement, or at least resistance that could be managed. But I did not offer any of those responses. And instead I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the table, sliding it forward without emphasis, without explanation, and I watched as Daniel's eyes lowered to it first, followed by Olivia's. And the change in their expressions was not immediate, but gradual, like recognition forming before comprehension fully arrives. And I did not speak while they opened it, because there was nothing to add at that moment, only clarity to observe. And as they turned each page, I could see the structure of their confidence begin to shift, not dramatically, not emotionally, but structurally, as if they were realizing that the foundation they had assumed was stable was not what they believed it to be. And when Daniel finally looked up at me, there was no anger in his expression, only confusion, and Olivia's posture had tightened slightly, her composure still intact on the surface but no longer effortless. And I allowed a pause to settle between us, long enough for the information to be fully absorbed, because timing matters more than explanation. And when I finally spoke, my voice remained steady, unchanged, not raised, not lowered, simply present, stating that certain decisions had already been reviewed and adjusted, that what they had assumed was in motion no longer reflected the current structure. And I watched as the meaning of that statement settled into them slowly, not as shock, but as realization. And I stood shortly after, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, and I gathered my things with the same calmness I had maintained throughout. And before leaving, I looked at them both once more, not with triumph, not with emotion, but with final clarity, because what had been built in silence had now been met with silence of a different kind, one that could no longer be interpreted as agreement. And I walked out of the room without waiting for a response, understanding that what they had just experienced was not conflict, but correction. The days that followed did not feel like an ending, but more like a shift in gravity, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. And I moved through my routine with the same calm structure as before, yet everything around me now responded differently, as if the balance of familiarity had been quietly recalibrated. And I noticed it in the smallest ways. The pauses in conversations that used to move without interruption, the hesitation before certain assumptions were made, the way Daniel now spoke more carefully when mentioning plans that once would have been presented as finalized, and Olivia, though still composed in appearance, no longer carried the same ease in her tone, as if she had begun to recognize that certainty was no longer guaranteed. And I did not comment on any of it, because there is no need to explain what is already unfolding on its own. And instead I focused on my own space, my own time, my own decisions, which now required no approval, no alignment, no validation from anyone else. And I found a different kind of clarity in that absence of expectation, a clarity that allowed me to observe without being pulled into reaction. And one afternoon Daniel called again, his voice more measured than before, asking if we could speak, not urgently, but carefully, and I agreed without hesitation, arranging to meet him at a quiet cafe not far from his office, a neutral space where emotions tend to soften simply because of surroundings. And when I arrived, he was already there, seated near the window, his hands folded in front of him in a way that suggested restraint rather than comfort, and I sat across from him, noticing immediately that he was choosing his words more deliberately than he used to, as if each sentence now carried additional weight. And he began by acknowledging that some things had not been fully understood during our previous conversations, that certain assumptions may have been made too quickly, and I listened without interruption, letting him speak fully, because clarity requires patience, not correction. And when he finished, there was a pause between us, the kind that once would have felt uncomfortable but now simply existed, and I responded calmly, not with explanation, not with justification, but with acknowledgement of structure, of boundaries that had already been set. And I could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand that this was no longer a conversation about negotiation, but about recognition. And he looked down briefly, his fingers adjusting slightly against the table, a small gesture that revealed more than his words. And when he spoke again, his tone was softer, less certain, asking not to change what had already been decided, but to understand it. And I told him simply that understanding was always available, but it had to come after awareness, not before it. And he nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the limits of the moment. And when I stood to leave, there was no resistance, no attempt to extend the conversation, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond the point of reversal. And I walked out into the afternoon light without looking back, because looking back was no longer necessary. And as I drove home, I realized that what had once felt like loss had become something else entirely, not gain, not victory, but alignment, a return to a position where silence no longer meant absence of voice, but presence of control. And when I arrived home, I did not feel the need to review anything, to confirm anything, or to anticipate anything further, because everything that needed to be understood had already revealed itself, and what remained now was simply continuation, on my terms, at my pace, without explanation, and without permission.